Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Alhamdulillah, this is the third session of the preservation of hadith, a brief introduction to the science of hadith by Shaikh Ibrahim Madani. May Allah forgive him and us. He says now, he's talking about upholding the meaning of the Quran and its relation to the Sunnah. He says, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself has taken the responsibility to preserve hadith, as indeed he has, then who can question their validity and authority? A closer look at the unique methods by which the ahadith have been preserved reveal them to be simply awe-inspiring and a miracle in their own right. These methods are briefly outlined below. The Shaykh is indicating to the fact that the ahadith, as mentioned previously, communicate to us the meanings of the Quran. And Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has assigned to himself subhanahu wa ta'ala the responsibility of preserving the Quran. And as was indicated too in the example of Ibn Mas'ud, showing us how to understand the Quran, we see that there is a knowledge that is related to proper understanding of the Quran that's not contained directly in the text, that's not contained directly in the Quranic text. So here the Shaykh is going to illustrate to us some of the means by which the ahadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or what is attributed to him, have been preserved. Some of the methodologies by which they have been preserved. But before going into that, let us note that the methodology of the companions in understanding the Quran is also a tripart methodology, just as the preservation of the Sunnah is documented here as being a tripart methodology, meaning 3 parts. The companions would memorize about 10 ayat at a time, understanding how to properly recite them, their meanings, and practice those ayat. And that's how they continued their relationship with the Quran. Proper recitation, understanding the meaning, memorization, practice. Recitation and memorization go along with understanding, right? They go along with understanding and practice. Right. So in the case of the Sunnah, we find that 3 methodologies or approaches are there. And that's first memory, practice, and then documentation. Right. So their recitation of the Quran was one that was full of understanding. It wasn't just reciting the Quran without understanding. So there's recitation with understanding, memorization, practice. In the case of the hadith, there's memorization, practice, documentation. Right. That's as the Sheikh is outlining the methodologies: memory, practice, documentation. He goes into understanding now, or giving us an understanding of these methodologies. First, we want to say that the role of the muhaddith in many instances has been disparaged as being one in which people are just narrating hadith without understanding, and that's not fair. When we look at the major scholars of hadith, they have a complete understanding of the Sunnah and fiqh of the Sunnah. We shouldn't judge the ulama of hadith by what took place in one period of time where a hadith are related with chain of transmission without the deep fiqh, without the deep understanding that we see among some of the imams. This is what a form of ta'an fi sunnah in some way, a form of disparaging the sunnah. When we look at the muhaddith in a disparaging way, the role of the muhaddith who's kamil, shamil, complete in his approach, right, and all encompassing in his knowledge, is that he has an understanding of fiqh of the hadith from all angles, from the side of the chain of transmission and the side of what the text means and how to apply it. So that's very important to understand. The Shaykh, he says, may Allah forgive him and us, generally three methods were used to preserve hadith. And we mentioned what they are: memorization, practice, and documentation. Memorization of the hadith, the practice of hadith, and the documentation of the hadith. The first method was memorization. The Arabs were renowned for their memories, particularly their ability to memorize long poems along with the biographies of their authors. They could recollect a long list of names of poets, forefathers, and their lineages. Not only that, the Arabs also memorized the lineages of their horses, even the horses' gaits. Thus, thousands of names were at the tip of their tongues, and through the blessings of the ahadith, Allah tabarak wa ta'ala added to their proficiency in the art of memorization. So this is the key idea. We're not going to go through every detail that's mentioned in the text, but we're going to go through a good part of it. This simple method of preserving hadith cannot be ignored, especially when we look at the case of people like Imam al-Bukhari. Right? There are some incidents, right, which have been recorded in the case of Marwan. Right? Marwan, his secretary Abu Azaza, he tested Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. And what he did was that he invited Abu Hurairah to his court, because Marwan doubted the amount of hadith that Abu Hurairah had memorized radiallahu anhu, and the hadith that he was narrating. So what he did was he instructed his secretary to hide while he questioned Abu Hurairah regarding a hadith, and to write down what he knew. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu didn't know that he was being tested. He narrated for quite some time. The secretary is quoted as relating, and the secretary had collected a large amount of scrolls or papers that documented a hadith. They waited for about a year, then called Abu Hurairah back again and tested him in the same way. And then the secretary checked to see if what Abu Hurairah narrated coincided with what was recorded. And so then what was said was that Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, upon being asked the same questions or series of questions that were asked before, he didn't change anything. He didn't add or subtract. And it's not known exactly how many hadith were related in that case, but it is considered to be a significant amount. Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri radiallahu anhu had the same incident. Right, then Imam Malik rahimahullah relates from him, rahmatullahi alayhi, Imam in hadith. The same is the case with Ibn Rahoya, who was the teacher of Bukhari. Now, Ibn Rahoya, there's two ways of mentioning his name, Ibn Rahaway or Rahoya. The ulama of hadith usually say Rahoya. They keep it according to its original way of saying or way of pronunciation. Rahaway is known to be the way to pronounce it in the Arabic language according to the linguist. The same was the situation with Abu Zura. He was also tested regarding his memory. And Wahshi, the same thing with Wahshi. Now this is very important. Although the details of people who memorized are important as well, but we said we were going to keep uh, our reading limited to a few minutes. So one point that he mentions is the love for knowledge. Right? These scholars possess a type of motivation that is almost beyond belief, he says. Indeed, their efforts to preserve hadith were like odysseys that were full of hardships and tribulations that are inconceivable today. And that's very important. That's very important. We are missing on both sides. The side of memorization, especially those of us who live in the West. Our memories are not worked hard enough. As we find the people in Mauritania, they focus on this. So the analytical approach to knowledge sometimes kills our ability to be balanced, right? And so we see this as an issue. We see this as an issue that needs to be corrected. The need to reintroduce memorization into seeking knowledge. But the other point is the issue of love. Love. That love, that attachment, that does something, that triggers something, right? That it triggers something within us. And this is something that we need to develop and cultivate, right? The second principle that we begin to develop or see develop in the preservation of the ahadith is the practice of the ahadith, right? So they practice what they understood. And this is also something which in today's time, we find that, there's a lot of concern for learning, but without memorization and without practice, right? Knowledge has become surrounded by debate. And thirdly, the issue of documentation, writing, right? The ahadith were codified later on, but they were written in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They began to be written in his time, and we see that one of the things that the Shaykh mentioned was how the hadith of Abu Hurairah were being collected, right? So there's a difference between codification and writing. Codification is when the ahadith are being systematized and collected in a very structured manner. When the ahadith are being written, they can be written in an informal manner. That doesn't mean that they were That doesn't mean they were distorted, because we see that memory played a huge role. Memory played a huge role. We shouldn't compare our time to that time. Different cultures, different understandings of knowledge, and so on and so forth. Some people like to judge by this time and try to say, how could that have been done? Actually, we're the ones that show weakness in our understanding and in our practice, and so on and so forth. But the principle is that preserve knowledge by writing. Preserve knowledge by writing. One of the collections that came down to us from this time period is Sahifa Sadiqa, right? Which Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, or Abdullah bin Amr bin As radiallahu anhu, he wrote all the ahadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Of course, that he had heard, that he had heard. Then there's the collection of Abu Hurairah, and is the largest collection. He recorded the largest collection. Imam ibn Abdul Bar, he narrates on the authority of Hassan bin Amr, who says, I narrated a hadith to Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, but he rejected it. I said, I have heard this hadith from you. He said, if you have heard this hadith from me, then I must have it written down. He held my hand and took me to his room. He showed me his library of books that comprised of his narrations from the Blessed Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He found the hadith I had narrated in the books. After that, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu said to me, did I not tell you that if I narrated any hadith to you, I must have written it down? Hafiz bin Hajar rahmatullahi alayhi, has also narrated this hadith in his book Fath al-Bari with another chain of transmission. Then there's the book of Anas. Anas radiallahu anhu also wrote down his collection of hadith. Sayyid bin Hilal says in the Mustadrak of al-Hakim, rahmatullahi alayhim jamia, when we asked a lot of questions, Anas radiallahu anhu pulled out a big bag, opened it, and would say, these are the ahadith that I have heard from the Blessed Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I wrote them down and have already shown them to the Blessed Prophet. So those are all indications that the ahadith were being written down, right? But we see in the time of Umar Abdul Aziz that the codification of the Sunnah is taking place. Actually, it's taking place in the time of Zuhri, right? It's taking place directly in the time of Zuhri, and it takes more formation with Malik, Imam Malik, rahmatullahi alayhi rahmatin wasi'ah, right? But because of the effort of Umar Abdul Aziz and Zuhri and Malik, we find that the Sunnah is beginning to be codified in a very systematic way, and that opens the path to the scholars who come after, like Bukhari and Muslim and so on and so forth, as well as the efforts of Imam Shafi'i rahmatullahi alayhi rahmatin wasi'ah. Imam Shafi'i, he did a lot for the concept of codification of hadith sciences. His Risala is considered a book that codified a lot of principles of a hadith. It was considered one of the first books to be written in hadith sciences. So we have the sciences of hadith along with the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam being codified and systematized. This is part of the effort that the ulama invested in preserving the Sunnah. يا ربنا اغفر لنا ذنوبنا واهدينا إلى طريقة الحق وبين لنا ما هو الصواب وارزقنا باتباع الحق.